The Chapin claim to fame is Harry Chapin. So 30,000 pounds of smashed bananas. Anybody? Cat in the cradle?
Yeah.
Okay, good. But if you're aficionado of Harry Chapin, it's you're going to recognize 30,000 pounds of smashed bananas. Glenn is going to get me started here. I would like to thank you for the podium this evening. I had nothing to do with this. It was brought in as a demonstration for a B-24. I think it's very appropriate that we have this, but I was really, when I saw this podium, I was hoping for the bottom to be full. There's no vodka. But anyway, no vodka in there. Okay, I'm Travis Chapin. I'm retired from BGSU. I taught construction management for 26 years. Previous to that, I was over at Norwalk on a construction company, which my dad started. I'm on the board of directors for the 8th Air Force Historical Society, which was founded about 1975. It was a social get-together for World War II veterans of the 8th Air Force. And I came on Johnny Come Lately. My father, Robert Chapin, was co-pilot on B-24's 26 missions out of England, and I'll have more on that later. The only time I've ever attended a meeting before was when William Pavanovich. Does anybody know if he's still alive? He was the World War II, he got shot down on March 6, 1944, and he was a POW, but he talked to this group, and it's been probably a couple years ago. But I know he made it till at least 75. PowerPoint expertise. When I got started on this, I knew I had to have PowerPoint. It's a little bit like having a steak dinner. If you have a steak dinner, you have to have parsley. It's always expected, so it's a PowerPoint presentation. But then Glenn changed it to a Google slideshow. Yeah. And hopefully, if we have any technological problems, it is Glenn's problem. Yeah. Glenn's problem. We'll go through that. As far as knowledge of airplane, there's a guarantee. As far as knowledge of airplane, I'm at the bottom of the list. I'm absolutely bottom. I was hoping, though, that I might have been in this group. I'm 70 years old, that I might have been in an airplane before anybody else. But then Ken Sperber showed up, and he's beat me by about 15 years doing that. Dad did have a Cessna 172, and I was probably in it when I was 5 years old. But the memory of that is probably when I was throwing up. And Dad always liked aviation fuel. He loved the smell of aviation. For me, aviation fuel doesn't cut it really with me at all. Oh, and why am I the speaker tonight? If Kim asks you to do something, you do it. And then you figure out what you're going to do. Kim and I work together at the College of Technology. Next slide. My expertise on flying. I sat as co-pilot seat with Dad enough that I knew I could fly a plane. And I was recently on an Alaska caribou trip. And I thought, well, if the pilot is 70 years old, I'd get it on the ground somehow. I wouldn't die. But then I realized there's no co-pilot on this sucker at all. It's just, he's there, I'm here, and if he died, I'd go down with him. 4 PSI in those, has anybody ever been in a bush plane? 4 PSI is what it was. And that's my son and my grandson. And then the next slide is we did get our caribou. This is one of 4 caribou that we got in August. My grandson, the 11-year-old Quinn, he got this one. And we got 420 pounds of meat back to Missoula, Montana, where my kids live. And I'm glad that happened because as a grandparent, I want to know my grandchildren can actually eat during the winter. They have food to eat. The subject matter, when Kim said, are you going to talk? I said, yes. What are you going to talk about? I was going through a 2nd Air Division, which is B-24 newsletter, and in that it had the subject matter of which is better, B-24 or B-17, and I grabbed that stuff. So on this, I'm going to ask the question, show of hands, does anybody have a preference for a B-17? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is a B-24. Okay, 6. Okay, anybody for a B-24? Okay, we got 4. Okay, anybody don't care. Okay, but anyways, as a B-17's the win. A side note, I've flown both. Collins Foundation out of Massachusetts. Before Dad passed away in '99 and '95, I think in '98, he and my brother and I, we flew in Witchcraft over Port Clinton, and it was memorable. I was more active than they were. They just got, they were up front. They paid an extra $200. I was back. I was co-pilot, bombardier. I was navigator. I was all over that place. It was fun. The 909, which I think many of you know, actually crashed in Massachusetts this year. I was on it over at Purdue about a year and a half ago before that happened. We're going to do a short clip, if Glenn can bring it up. We've got two videos. One is 2 minutes long on B-17 and then a B-24. We'll do those and then we'll continue in on the conversation. So do your magic. Thank God for Glenn. There we go.
The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was one of the 2 standard heavy bombers that served in the air war in Europe. The other large American bomber was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. These were the 2 main strategic bombers for the United States until the arrival of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress in 1944. The B-17 served in almost every theater of World War II, but it was used mostly by the United States Army Air Force, based in the United Kingdom to bomb German targets. The first missions were in daylight hours to improve accuracy, but without adequate fighter coverage, this strategy resulted in very heavy losses of aircraft and crew. Its first bombing mission was with the Royal Air Force's Fortress 1, but it was hardly ready for war. As refinements progressed, along with better pilot training and tactics, it became a powerful weapon in the Allied war against Germany. The Boeing B-17 was instrumental in liberating Europe and the Pacific. It will forever be remembered as one of the great aircraft of aviation history.
Okay, and the next one, I just thank God for the internet. I don't know how anybody did anything back in the day. To think that I would have to go ahead and start the other one. But to think that I would be able to go through the library and grab stuff and photocopy it, I don't know. But this one's on the B-24. There's the 4 of us that like the B-24, I might add.
The consolidated B-24 Liberator was one of the most famous bombers of World War II. It was the most produced American wartime aircraft, with more than 18,400 airplanes built. It gained a distinguished war record with operations in the European, Pacific, African, and Middle Eastern theaters. It followed in the footsteps of the other great American World War II bomber, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. In 1938, the United States Army Air Corps sent a request to Reuben Fleet, the founder of Consolidated Aircraft, to become a second source for the Boeing B-17. Fleet didn't want to produce a design that was already 4 years old and suggested he could build something new. He offered to build an entirely new aircraft. The new aircraft would be based on the new high aspect ratio data swing that had been successfully used on the Model 31. The engine nacelles would be the same as the PB White Catalina. In 1939, a contract was awarded for a test model as the XB-24. The data swing demonstrated such remarkable performance on the early flights of the XB-24 that orders were arriving even before production had started. The B-24 was produced at 5 factories in Fort Worth, Texas, Dallas, Texas, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Willow Run, Michigan, and San Diego, California. In Europe, Bomber Command of the Royal Air Force concentrated mainly on night bombing, while the United States Army 8th Air Force operated primarily as a day bombing force. On December 4th, 1942, U.S. B-24s of the 9th Air Force attacked Naples, recording their first raid on Italy. The U.S. Army Air Force casualties were among the highest for bombing forces. This was well illustrated on August 17, 1943, when 59 bombers were shot down attacking German factories during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. This was followed by Black Thursday, when 60 out of 220 bombers were lost during the second raid on Schweinfurt on October 14th. On March 6, 1944, a force of 750 B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked Berlin in daylight. 68 planes did not return on that mission. As losses mounted, the B-24 was becoming unpopular with pilots and crews. Unlike the easy-handling Boeing B-17, which had a reputation of getting its crews home despite major damage, the B-24 was not easy to fly, and it was not as durable. It was gaining a reputation as a widowmaker. Flak was a serious problem over Europe. The accuracy and concentration of flak was never contemplated during the design of the B-24. Germany was very good at delivering flak, which became very accurate after the development of radar. Survivability increased with better formation flying and with better fighter escort coverage from the long-range P-51 Mustang. The B-24 excelled in the Pacific. Flak was less of a factor, and its long range and faster speed was an advantage for distant island targets. At the end of the war, the B-24 was retired from service. Incredibly, the B-24 is recorded as having dropped over 630,000 tons of bombs, while several thousand enemy aircraft fell to its guns. Despite its drawbacks, the consolidated B-24 helped liberate Europe and Asia, and will forever be remembered as one of the great aircraft of aviation history.
Okay, so that's our video portion of the program. As far as the next slide, look, the vote right now is 6 for B-17s and 4 for B-24s. Just so I took a tally of what the score is right here. And I will tell you that what I'm going to try to do is convince you that that was not necessarily correct. These are the numbers. I just looked them up. Internet, once again, is just a wonderful tool. Speed, maximum speed is about the same, but a B-24 could cruise faster. And the wingspan was longer on the B-24, but the plane was actually shorter, as you can see by those numbers. The interesting thing, though, is the wing area, the 14,020 square feet versus the 1,048 square feet that Davis Wing designed. So it was, I have another slide that shows you the comparison of the two. One of the things is that the Flying Fortress could actually fly higher, a mile higher, which doesn't help in accuracy, but those flak guns have to actually get up another mile, which certainly doesn't help in the safety being on a B-24. The number produced, the numbers there you can see are 12,731 and 18,400. How many people have been to Willow Run? Maybe Willow Run up there is the common, and that's where they made it. I love to tell the story of when Consolidated was making planes, B-24s out in California. It was one a day, and when Ford Motor Company got a hold of it, it was 1 an hour. So we knew how to do that. Still flying today, the numbers right there. There are 9 B-17s of 40 that exist, and there are only 2, one of which is the Witchcraft, which I had the opportunity to fly on. Bomb loads gets a little confusing as I'm going through there. It's the B-24 certainly had more bomb weight and capacity than what the B-17 did. In fact, I've heard it say amongst the B-24 people that the B-24 was the container that hauled the B-17s around. The next one is this is for you aviation geeks, this whole Davis Wing design. If we go through this whole thing, basically what it said, it was great for the B-24, but essentially when the plane started to speed up, this whole wave drag, I don't know what wave drag is, I didn't look at it, but this whole technology disappeared. So if the planes right now, There's no new planes that are going to have a Davis wing design. Okay, which one's better? Another vote. You got to vote Ford, Chevy, or don't care. How many people are Ford people? How many people are Chevy people? How many people don't care? Okay.
Clear order.
Don't care. I think that if you get into the adage where not that my grandfather had, but my grandfather had a Model T Ford, my grandfather had a Ford Thunderbird, my dad had a Mustang, and I have a F-150 pickup truck, that it's going to be hard to convince anybody that a Chevy is better than a Ford. I think a little bit of that. I sat around the table, heard very little from Dad during the years that I sat at the table with the family at supper, but one thing we knew that a B-24 was better than a B-17, and I'm going to somewhat try to convince you of that. As far as the flights, the B-17 was 1935, as it showed in the film. The B-24 was 1939, and the B-17 got started a little bit earlier in Europe than what the B-24 did. But the side point, the genesis of the multi-engine bomber was a two-engine concept, and it was to sink ships. The whole idea was that if we got invaded, we had to sink ships, and we needed bombers to be able to do that and defend our coastline. That never did happen. Anybody familiar with Billy Mitchell? Billy Mitchell got fired. He got everybody amped up, tried to sink ships, and everybody thought he was crazy. But of course he was correct. One well-placed bomb from a B-24 or a B-17 can sink a battleship. And it's better to invest in a whole bunch of airplanes. Yes?
If you check out the Battle of Midway, it was pretty hard to hit a moving ship from a high altitude.
It is indeed. It was the dive bombers that actually got them.
The B-17 that went out from Midway didn't get a thing.
Yeah. I saw a video on sinking a battleship, the German battleship, and trying to hit those suckers was like impossible. In fact, the Luftwaffe had a hard time sinking transport ships out of England for the same reason. They drop bombs and nothing would happen. The Flying Fortress, as it showed in the film, didn't work out so well, because the idea was, we got 9 machine guns, ME-109s, come on baby, we're going to wipe you out. That didn't work out very well. And of course machine guns didn't help very much with flak. That created a problem. And then the P-51 Mustang showed up, Tuskegee Airmen, that's part of the group. Anybody know Harold Brown? Harold Brown Top, is he still around?
Well, wasn't he a year or two ago? When did we hear him speak?
He was at the library.
A year maybe?
He was at the library, and very articulate, and I should look him up. I was going to do that. Could a B-17 sustain more battle damage? It's coming up. Okay, there it is. The one thing that, as I'm reading through this, there's more metal to hit. There's more sheet metal to tear up. There's more stuff to look really bad when it comes back. That's the tail section of a B-17, of course, on the left, and a B-24 got shot up. And you can see all sorts of that on the internet. The next view is I was fortunate enough to go through and grab an image. Those are proportionally correct. Obviously, it's the B-17 on the left. I talked about the 1,420 square feet of surface area of the wing, and then the Davis wing design on the B-24 on the right created less surface, 1,042 square feet with more lift and that. And one of the arguments that they make when they talk about the B-17 is that there's more of that to be shot up, and then when it comes back it looks like, oh, this is really bad, whereas a B-24 may not be in that situation. When I first got to this idea of the subject, it was B-17 versus B-24. And so, being the genius that I am, I got to Google and I typed in B-17 versus B-24, and this came up. It's a 29-page article, and as it turns out, I'm sure that it was written by a B-24 advocate, because the conclusion of the article was the argument, as long as there's two veterans pilots, one from a B-17 and a B-24, they will argue until their deaths, but it will always be the B-24 that knows that he's right on that. As far as the safety, I'm going to try to convince you that the safety of the B-24 was actually better than what it was on the B-17, though that was the attitude that everybody had. The Plesky oil fields, when Glenn fired up the background music, so to speak, for this presentation, on the screen, the first thing I saw was Plesky. And Plesky, I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but it was in Romania, and there was all sorts of ideas during World War II as to how are we going to stop the Germans. That Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid that they talked about, it was ball bearings. If we could get rid of the ball bearings, we're going to wipe out the ball bearings, and then we're going to stop the German operation. That was a disaster. The other one, which was fuel, and Germany didn't have it. Japan was in worse shape. If we could cut out, and that was the whole war, basically, is the Japanese, we were trying to limit their oil supply and all that sort of thing. They don't have any oil. And Germany doesn't have much oil anyway, and Romania is where they got it. They conquered Romania. And the Plesky oil fields was a raid that was held on August 1st, 1943. And it was low altitude. This was, and I have this, this is EAA. It is called Experimental Aircraft Activity. And that was experimental. They left from Libya. There was 178 planes that left that day, and only 88 returned. There were 310 crew members that were killed. But it was low altitude, but it was secret. The Germans didn't know we were coming. The Germans knew everything that was coming. The lead pilot, he went down in the Mediterranean. Nobody ever understood why. It became a cluster. I'll let you fill in the rest of that after that. And they had some navigational errors. They were going down to Budapest. They were coming back, and they were flying this way, that way. It was supposed to be all timed, and they were going through, and it was a mess. And it was only at 200 feet, was what it was. And that was one of the things that B-24s would actually get involved with. They would be at low altitude doing that sort of crazy stuff. And then the other overall stats of casualties for the 8th Air Force, the numbers that I got were 40, do this math, 47,483 casualties. Over half of those are dead. There's something called altitude, and when you fall and you crash on the ramp, you generally don't get injuries. You don't get injuries. And but so there were 26. There were actually more crew members from the 8th Air Force killed during World War II than there were Marines in the entire. And we lost over 400,000. But if you look at that as a side note, the Soviet Union population lost 40 times more people than we did in the United States. One of three, I think it was 1 of 3 or 1 or 4 Russians, Soviets, were injured, were a casualty during World War II. So when they start building the Iron Curtain and things like that to protect them, there's some justification for that. I'm going to read. I was going to read an excerpt, but I'm not going to go in there. It's out of this article, but essentially, the numbers towards the end of the war, they actually went through, and rather than having this, well, this is what B-17, they actually did the numbers, but as they entered the end of the war, 16.93% of the flights, but they had 22.28% of the losses. Whereas the B-24s, they had 16, and this is towards the end of the war, 16.85% of the flights, but they had 14.99% of the actual losses. So to get in a B-24 wasn't really possibly the coffin maker that they had thought it was. Okay, here we come, the Memphis Belle. The first, how many people know that the Memphis Belle was the first First one to complete. Okay, that's misinformation. It's not true. It wasn't even the first It wasn't even the first B-17 to finish the missions. Next one. Next slide. It's amazing what Hollywood can do for you.
It was a good movie.
Oh, it's a good movie. It's a good movie. But it's based on the fact that B-17, the U.S. population was indoctrinated with the B-17 back during World War II. And one of the reasons was the Memphis Belle got back to the United States to fly around. And I want money. Well, war bonds. War bonds, give me money, give me money. So it's flying around, everybody's seeing B-17 and Memphis Belle. They make movies out. They made one in 1944. They made one in 1990 something or other. But that's this one, the Memphis Belle. So it's a great movie, but it wasn't. Next slide. The next slide is actually the first B-17 that completed was Hell's Angel. Hell's Angel was the first B-17 to complete it on May 13th, 1943. The Memphis Belle was the second one, B-17 to complete it. Finished the missions 4 days later on that. And it returned to the United States. Hell's Angel actually stayed over there for a while. But the whole thing was initially, it became a reality with the 8th Air Force, if we actually have 25, okay, you're going to fly until the war's over. I'm dead. If you don't give me a finish line, I'm dead. Because it was obvious in the winter of '43. That was what Bill Plavancha was. He was flying in the midst of all that. It was terrible. But they had to set a limit. The limit was 25, and that's hence the Memphis Belle supposedly was the first one to finish that. But it was really Hell's Angel. But they brought the Memphis Belle back, and then they made movies about it. And however, Hot Stuff, a B-24, was the first heavy bomber to complete it. May and February 1943, 3 months before the Memphis Belle. But it didn't come back to the United States. And the reason it didn't come back to the United States is the next one. On May 3rd, 1943, 10 days before Hell's Angel completed it, keep in mind, Hot Stuff had already completed it, it was flying missions, and somebody got the idea, you know, we could take that back to the United States. That'd be a good idea. It was a good idea until this happened. And it had completed it, and it crashed in Iceland on the way back on May 3rd, 1943. The consequences of that, Hot Stuff was returning to the U.S. for war bonds. It would have gotten here before Memphis Belle or Hell's Angel ever finished their missions. It would have been in the United States, except for this unfortunate. They decided to load everybody up. There were 16. There were 16 individuals in there. And they loaded it up, and they headed back. They were supposed to stop in Prescott, Scotland, and go, hey, anybody got a weather report? They flew past that. And they went to Iceland, and they're trying to they found the ground, and they ran into the mountaintop. The consequences of this is that this Lieutenant General Frank Maxwell Andrews died in the crash along with 14 others. Amazingly, the tail gunner survived. He was sitting on the mountaintop for 24 hours until somebody found him, and it was like, whoa, what happened? But General Frank Maxwell Andrews died in the crash with 14 others. The consequence of this is that in the 1930s, he was an advocate for bombers. It's like, hey, battleships? Screw that. Let's, bombers. Would you shut up about bombers? And he got thrown in the wash waters of everything. And then, as it turned out, George Marshall, he was the one that ran the whole operation out of Washington to both the Pacific Theater and the Atlantic Theater. And he'd worked with Andrews before. He said, hey, yo, come on, let's go to England. And in February of 1943, he was commander of the U.S. forces in Europe. Ike was busy taking care of North Africa and all of that. And then in February of 1943, he crashes into a mountain. And the question is, would he have become the commander of Operation Overlord, which was D-Day invasion instead of Eisenhower? Would he have run the actual operations of getting to Berlin? And the obvious next question is, would he have become president? But there was a potential in the research that General Andrews would have been Eisenhower. As to whether that happened, there's some speculation. I could probably read for hours and hours. But if I answer each of these questions, yes, 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 we most likely wouldn't be sitting here today. There's no way the cookie would have crumbled that Travis Chapin would have been here, or you would have been here. It would have been some other combination of some sort. So Frank Maxwell Andrews, nobody knows about too much. Now, about my dad, Robert F. Chapin. He was in the 300 Maniac Bomb Group, B-24s out of Hethel, England. There were 40 bomb groups throughout England. 21 of them were B-17s, 19 were B-24s. I had the opportunity 2 years ago to go to Hethel. What's left is there's the runway, car company took over the runway, there's some of the buildings, there's a museum. They have people that are selling old stuff and displays and all that sort of thing. Well, I showed them my dad's dog tag, and it was like, the one guy, oh, holy shit, it's Sunday. Can I buy you some coffee? There's no big booze, but he'd have bought me a booze of somewhere. But Dad flew 26 missions. First one was on December 4th, 1944. The last was on April 20th, 1945. He rarely talked about his experience. I have Mom and Dad, they have about 500 letters. I have read so many times, I love you, darling. I love you, darling. There's a lot in there. There's not a whole lot of technical information. One interesting thing, though, was Pam and Jerry. Mom and Dad were married at the time, so Dad goes off overseas, and they write back and forth, and they talk about their children, Pam and Jerry. That's the one. A week later, Pam and Jerry were like this. Pam and Jerry, Pam and Jerry, Pam and Jerry. It was all through these things. It's like, man, my name ain't Jerry. I got 4 brothers. There's 4 boys, and there's 1 daughter, and there ain't no Pam and Jerry in there at all. And it was like, okay, I don't know what, they changed their mind. Well, my wife was listening to an old-time radio station one time, and Pam and Jerry is Detectives Mr. and Mr. North. It was a series that was going on the radio, and as it turned out, the name of Pam and Jerry was simply Mom and Dad's code name. My first son was Tater. The second one was Tater 2. That was the code name. He returned home on August 1945. It was just come home. He started a construction company in Norwalk. There's a lot of heavy highway construction companies in Norwalk, and Dad was one of 4 that started these various ones. In fact, Norwalk's football stadium is called Contractors Stadium. It's called Whitney's Field. That's where I played football and ran track and all that sort of thing, and became famous in my own mind. But it was Whitney Field forever. And then the contractors in Norwalk got together and donated $750,000 to the new AstroTurf, to everything, to rebuilding it, a bunch of work. In fact, that was my nephew, my dad's grandson, and my dad would be very, very proud of the fact that Matt was the one that did that. But with Chapin and Chapin, what we did is we did concrete paving throughout the eastern United States. I graduated from Purdue in 1972. I worked there for 15 years, and I got to the point of, do I really care about a construction project in Nashville, Tennessee? And then I went back to Purdue, got my master's degree, and then went to Bowling Green and worked there. He died in 1975, and as I say, he didn't talk too much. I have been a guardian I have been a guardian for the honor flight, as has Kim, has been a guardian. Anybody else been a guardian for honor flight? It was flying the World War II veterans back to World War II Memorial. And I was, it was after Dad had passed away, and having gotten involved in 2008 in the honor flight, then I got involved in the 8th Air Force Historical Society, and I've been there I've been to 4 of the reunions, and unfortunately, I got to become the board of directors, which is another thing. The problem with the 8th Air Force Historical Society, it was founded to be a social group for World War II veterans, and they're not here. But I think we have one that's going to watch this, and you're a 95-year-old B-24 pilot. Congratulations, good job. You're flying the right plane.
His name's Bob Stoos.
Bob?
Stoos, S-T-O-O-S.
Bob Stutz, you're the man. Okay, thanks. Okay. And the vote was 6-4, B-17s versus B-24s for the 4. Now it's at least 6-5. Okay, good. We got it. We're agreeing on that. But my unfinished business that I talk about, well, on the honor flight, the stories, the first time I was a guardian, I had the opportunity 4 or 5 times. Bill Wyrick here in town, he was mobile. How many people have seen World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C.? Okay. Vietnam Memorial? Okay. You can get the gist of it. We stopped at World War II, and Bill was enough. Typically what you do is you load back up on the buses, you drive around and go to the Vietnam Memorial, and you get off the buses. Well, Bill was able to walk over there. And it was April of 2008, and Bill and I, rather than getting back on the bus, we journeyed across the mall and went to the Vietnam Memorial. We went to the Vietnam Memorial. It would have been his son's 60th birthday, but his son's name was on the wall. So it doesn't take too much to see the symbolism here of who Travis Chapin was in this rendition. And there's just all sorts of other stories that was very rewarding. The one thing, and I asked in conclusion, I asked my wife this question, and I think most people would answer different than what my wife did. And the question is, well, Dad died in '99, and very little conversation about World War II. And then in 2008, I discovered honor flight, and then I got involved in the 8th Air Force Historical Society. And I think the layperson would say, you know, Travis, your dad would be so proud of you. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that Dad would be proud of the fact that I went and investigated and have dedicated, I know more. I read an obituary for my dad after I got involved, and it said Robert Chapin. It was for a contractor magazine. Robert Chapin was a command pilot who flew 35 missions in Europe. And I cried. And the reason I cried is I know more about what my dad did now that he's dead than I ever did when he was alive. He wasn't a command pilot, and he didn't fly 35 missions. He was a co-pilot, and he flew 26 missions. And I'm not so sure, but when Robert Chapin, who had 2 pair of pants when he was a kid, raised in the Depression, when he got back from World War II and never made the command pilot, and he was just a co-pilot, he said, by God, I'm going to show him what it's all about. As to whether Dad would be proud of the fact that his son, Travis, knows more about his involvement during World War II now than when he was there, I did write, in conclusion, I did write a little thing for the 8th Air Force Historical Society newsletter, and it was said, and the title of it was, Who was to blame, Dad or me? And no, it's about that much in the paper. And it basically goes through the history that Dad and I didn't talk. And who's the bully? Was it me? Was it Dad? And I think in the conclusion of my thing was I think we were both to blame. And the final note on this thing, almost the final note, is your unfinished business. The question for everybody in the audience is, do you have unfinished business that you should be talking to somebody, whether it be Korea, Vietnam, whatever, and that I should have? It's Corey, right? Corey shared that his grandpa, long since gone, and a lot of that's lost. I did bring over here, I had some books I wanted to bring. So I was looking around for an appropriate container to bring the books in. His dad's war bag is what it was. And you got a lot of books over there. Masters of the Air. Shot Down. I know Steve Snyder about his dad being shot down. Laura Edge, she went and toured where her dad went as a POW. This is Harold Brown's Keep Your Speed Up, Tuskegee Airmen. Oh, one interesting thing on Tuskegee Airmen. Harold Brown became a POW at the end of the war. Okay, so he's in POW camp. And this Jewish kid comes up and says, "Hey, I'm Jewish. What if they find, I'm on, he said, "Hey dude, look at me, I'm black." So he said, "You don't have anything, just keep your mouth shut, you'll be okay." Lost Airmen, this is a grandson who wrote a book about his dad that was shot down. This one was somebody that he was actually a German citizen as a 6-year-old, and they deported him back to Germany, and he had to live that. These are some silk maps from Dad's escape trip. This is, I met this guy, he was a POW, and let me see what else I have. And then another down in the airport, and this guy, he finished his dad's memoirs on being a B-17, B-24 pilot, and then and then this is my tomorrow morning I'll be in my tree stand. Anybody else deer hunting? No deer hunters? Oh, okay. Here's my deer hunter joke. The deer hunter joke, it goes real quick. And keep this, because oftentimes you go away from these things and the only thing you're gonna, what did they talk about? Well, I'm not sure. They told a joke. The joke was, St. Peter sometimes, when he gets bored in heaven, he goes down the pearly gates. On this particular day, he goes down, he grabs the resumes of 3 individuals. The first one had an IQ of 120. He went and talked to him about, quantum physics, space travel, all that sort of thing. Good conversation. This guy had an IQ of 105. Talked about social activities and all that sort of thing. Sports was a good one. Had a wonderful conversation. Next guy had an IQ of 90. St. Peter's just thinking. Goes up to him and says, "So, did you get your deer this year?" "So I'll let you know if I get my deer this year. I did last year. I got my caribou. So with that, we'll go to the next one, which is, this is the veterans at the 8th Air Force Historical Society 2 years ago. That's the only one from the 389th Bomb Group was there, but they're getting less and less. There were less last year, certainly. Okay, the next slide is the take home. You're going to go home and say, "What did the speaker?" I've been 44 minutes. I'm almost done. The take home. The questions are: was the B-24, the B-17 a better plane, or did urban legend play into it? I hope I've convinced you, at least the question about that Memphis Belle was not the first one. That's propaganda. Anyway, Memphis Belle was not the first one. Hot Stuff would have been a better movie anyway. I mean, could you imagine it? Hey, you want to go see Hot Stuff with me? It would have been a better movie. Did history take a significant turn with the death of General Andrews? What unfinished story do you have to tell or learn from another veteran? And remember our vets. And then the final book that I have is right here, and Corey can relate to this. Okay, so final slide. This is my new job. Agility training for my Australian Kelpie. I think our marriage will survive it. I'm not sure. There is some question because I'm generally in charge of the puppy. She is now 15 weeks old. And at 15 weeks old, Corey, I don't know if you found this with yours, but the Tasmanian devil comes out in the evening. I mean, like crazy, crazy. I don't know if you guys know it, but this is the evening, and the dog is with my wife. I hope that she might change the locks before I get there. But okay, that's my presentation. Any questions, comments? Anybody want to say anything? Kim, anybody want to blame Kim for it? Oh yes.
What was the name of your dad's plane?
It was he was in 4 different planes, and it was D-Day patches. Now he got there on December 4th, 1940. His first mission was December 4th, 1944, and ultimately he flew 13 of those 26 with Don Franks, and it was D-Day patches. And the reason it was D-Day patches is they dropped a fragmentary bomb on D-Day. It went down, it blew up, blew holes in it, and when they renamed it, they called it D-Day patches. Do you have any planes that you have a memory of or an affection to?
I want to put the name of this.
What's this one going to be called?
D-Day patch.
D-Day patches? Okay. Well, the significance of it is when we went to Hethel, in 2 years ago, they actually had a picture of all the planes that went through Hethel. They had a picture of D-Day patches, is what it was. But Dad had 4 different pilots, and it was a great learning experience for Dad because he went over there. He spent Christmas Eve with his pastor from the Presbyterian Church in Norwalk, Ohio. He didn't know that he got to Hethel, and the base chaplain was a preacher from Norwalk, Ohio. But he was a pretty straight-laced person, and I think some of the pilots that he had was kind of like, hey boy, I know you're married, but we got some other things to do, and that didn't work out. So it was a great learning experience. Yes.
I never heard, how did the 25 missions work out for the individuals? Because a lot of times you got moved from one aircraft to another, and so it's not by necessarily crew.
Right.
So each individual had to keep track, or they
It would be an individual. The problem with the Memphis Belle and the disparity with what Dad experienced was everybody with the Memphis Belle had this understanding. You trained together, you flew to Europe together, you flew together, you did your 25 missions, you came back home, and you partied for the rest of your life, hence the 8th Air Force Historical Society. So I think individually they kept track of it, but with the Memphis Belle, the crews, and they were tight crews, but Dad's was, but by the time Dad got there was a lot of replacements and all of that. But then it upped to 35, eventually, is what it did. And get through your 35 missions. Bob, anyway, there's a ball turret gunner. There's a movie called Cold Blue, and it's about B-17s, and the ball turret gunner guy, he completed his 35 missions. He was from McClure, over where I am, but he's since passed away. But he finished his 35 missions in like 6 weeks, and he was back. It was boom, 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 good luck and go. But by the time by the time Dad got there, we pretty much had air superiority over Germany. The Luftwaffe. If anybody criticizes the bombing that we had with the 8th Air Force and the death and turmoil and disaster and fires and people dying and guts all over the place, and it's like, that is inexcusable. You can't, no way. Just the thing that we had to have was air superiority when we went across that channel. if the Luftwaffe was in charge, and the only reason the Luftwaffe wasn't in charge is because of the 8th Air Force. They took them down with the B-17s, they took them down with the P-51 Mustangs. They took them down, they took them down, they took them down. And without that happening, it would have never happened without that bombing. And of course, it affected the war condition. But in September of '44, they were producing more fighters in Germany than they were before. It was amazing. But the thing that we got them on was the Luftwaffe. They couldn't fuel the planes. They couldn't train anybody. They couldn't do anything. And it was only because of the 8th Air Force and the bombing that happened. But any other question? Yeah, Glenn.
Didn't you say that after 25 missions that they would let them go, or was
Yes.
that basically the? Okay.
Yeah, and initially it became in 42 was the first bombing mission. When it got into 42 and 43, the British to go to bed at night they bombed at night, and it was like, we're gonna bomb and we're gonna kill whatever's in our way, and there was no strategic bombing to it. And with our daylight bombing, it didn't take any. The dumbest Mississippi farm boy would do the math and say, I ain't gonna make it through this. We got to have a limit somehow. And at 25, and then they upped it to eventually to 35 by the time Dad got there.
Oh, okay.
But Dad wrote a letter in April 20th, 1945, and said, honey, I got 9 more missions to fly. I'll be home after my 9th mission. That was the last mission he flew, because they ran out of targets. May 8th, 1945 was the end of the war. I think the last 8th Air Force was April 25th, shortly after Dad. There wasn't anything left to bomb. And they did trolley runs afterwards. They took the crews from the ground crews, put them in the planes, and flew over what they had destroyed. They'd never seen it. And in fact, Dad had never seen it. We've got pictures of the trolley runs where it's low level. But he never saw it because it was 28,000 feet, 25,000 feet. However, he did do the Operation Varsity, which was when we crossed the Rhine River. They wanted supplies for Patton's troops and everything. And so they take B-24s 200 feet off the ground. And go, okay, get to the other side and drop that stuff. And as it turned out, I would not be standing here today if Dad was in this plane instead of this plane. Because Don Franks, the pilot that I went to see down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and talked more about World War II than Dad ever did, he was sitting here, Dad was sitting here, and the floor crew was over there, and they went down and everybody was killed. So it was just, and it was at 200 feet. Machine gun type stuff, where hay bales start to become machine gun nests, and that. But it was generally way up there. That's what they were. Okay, well, a good group. If you liked it, thank me. If you didn't, blame Kim.
One last question.
Okay.
What's your goal of being part of the 8th Air Force Historical Society?
Okay, the goal, I was asked twice to be on the board. First time I said no, second, and then the next year I came around and I said yes. As it turns out, the goal, I don't know. We're in transition on that because there is this attitude, we will not forget. We will remember. We will remember. How are we going to do that? We will remember. And with it being come next gen, I'm next gen. My son is next gen, and my grandchildren are next gen. And to get them to go that, as to whether the 8th Air Force Historical Society is going to survive going from a social group where it was B-24, B-17, and crew members getting together for social activity, and go into the next gen. God will remember. Gotta remember. It's going to be a tough transition, and the whole the whole 8th Air Force World War II history community is a very fragmented community. The 100th Bomb Group is like they're an entity in themselves. They're one of 40, and Dad's the 389th Bomb Group. When Jenny and I went last year to St. Louis, it was Jenny, that's my wife, myself, and Alan Hollick. And that's all that represents the 388th Bomb Group. So what's going to happen in the transition? There is, if anybody goes to Savannah, has anybody been to the 8th Air Force Historical Museum in Savannah, Georgia? There's 8th Air Force Historical Museum in Savannah, Georgia. Very well worth a visit. But they're not connected with society and So in answer to your question, Kim, I'm going to survive as best I can and see what we did. Oh, on the board of directors, we have Paul Tibbetts' grandson. Paul Tibbetts, the one that was in the Enola Gate, and he's on the board of directors now. As to what the future is, any of this stuff, and we have passed an interesting milestone. 75 is very significant. They had a 75th anniversary of Gettysburg. 70 and Roosevelt was a big activity. 75th anniversary. Confederate soldiers, so old gray-haired guys who are 90 years old, 95 years old. That was it. And we just passed 75. We're done. We don't have any more. September 2nd came. That's a month behind us, a month and a half behind. So what happens in the future is hard to tell.
You said there's 2 flying 24s now?
Right.
What were they?
One was the Collins Foundation.
Right.
The other, I'm not sure. It might be the Texas, what do they call it? The Confederate Air Force, which is now the Consolidated Air Force because the Consolidated.
Commemorated airport.
Strawberry Bitch, is that the one that did that get repainted into the?
Which craft got? It's a dark olive.
Okay.
Is what it is. But where the other one is, I'm not sure. Oh, and the final thing is I would love to get in a time machine and go back to 1947 and just get down on my knees in Arizona and say, please don't melt that thing down. Please don't melt that. I'll pay whatever it is because it's going to be really valuable. They melted them down anyway. They're gone. And you guys are into putting things back together that should have been thrown away. Hell, they were thrown away a long time ago. You bring them out of the junk pile and put them back together and call them an airplane.
You know if there's any 24s under reconstruction?
I don't know of any that's going to be rebuilt. I did have a conversation with a guy down in Savannah, and he said that they were trying to collect the parts to put one together down for the 8th Air Force Museum. But it's a tough one. It's kind of like George. A guy goes to an auction, and they're selling George Washington's hatchet. The guy says, George Washington's hatchet. He says, yeah, it's the original one. He says, chop down the cherry tree. George Washington's hatchet, the original one. He says, well, it's had 2 new heads and 5 new handles, but it's the same one. And you guys are doing that all the time. You're putting it back together. Anybody's trying. Okay. But, I'm going to get my deer tomorrow morning. Maybe. Okay. Thank you very much.